I have a great esteemed panel of state representatives and senators. Their bios are in your program, so I'm not going to spend too much time giving their backgrounds. You can read up on it, and that way we'll have plenty of time, hopefully, for questions and answers at the end. Representative Erik Fresen from Florida, Senator Clark Jolley from Oklahoma, and Senator Tollison from Mississippi. I've had the pleasure of working with all three of these gentlemen on a variety of issues in Florida, but specifically on A through F and school accountability in the states of Oklahoma and Mississippi. And so I want to, you're at a panel, it's not a secret what we're here to talk about, grading schools, A, B, C, D, F. So let me start with this question. How many of you in the audience have heard of A, B, C, D, F? Raise your hand. How many of you know what you kind of know what that means? You kind of know that A and B is good, D and F is bad, C means there's a lot of room for improvement, especially if this was applied to your child in school. So when I talk to lawmakers and individuals across the country, one of the things I talk about is all 50 states have to have a school accountability system, right? So under federal law, we all have to have a system. I believe there are two kind of functions of that school accountability system. The first is to communicate to parents and the public. And the second function is to measure things that are important to you, to measure things in a way that drives school behavior for the outcomes that you want to achieve. So there are it's the calculation side of what goes into what you measure, and there is the descriptor side. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time in the intro to talk about the descriptors, okay? And I'm not going to pick on specific states. I'm not going to name the states, but I'm going to talk to you about some of the states that we've worked with who have changed their nomenclature to A through F, and some of the states that we're currently working with that have a different naming convention. So there is a state that I was in, I think last week, that grades their schools red, orange, yellow, lime green, and dark green. So let me just pause there for a second. And if you're a parent of a child at an orange school, what does that really mean to you as a parent? I stood up with a governor probably a year ago in a state, and the nomenclature was this: fully accredited, conditionally accredited, accredited with warning, denied accreditation. Some of you may be from that state, so I'm not naming you because you've already changed to A through F. But when I was talking to the audience, I said, how many in here, we were in a high school, it's full of actually parents and teachers and folks who had come to listen to this governor speak. I said, how many understand what that nomenclature means? I think there were 3 hands in the crowd, and one of them might have been the school principal. Might not have been the school principal as well. And I said, and how many of you know the difference between that accreditation and like regional SACS accreditation or accreditation for sports? I have worked in states that have used the levels 1 through 5, 5 stars, 4 stars, 7 stars, and I've worked in states where their designation for what we would call a D, the description was schools in need of excellence. And so as a parent, how are you to understand exactly if there is learning going on in that school or not? And so one of the things that I hope you will hear from the panelists, I hope you will be persuaded of, is that grading schools with a naming convention that parents immediately understand, even if they don't understand the calculation, you're winning half the battle of what you're trying to accomplish in school accountability. You're communicating something effectively to the audience of parents who need to know, and to the general public. Because I will tell you, when schools get a D or an F, there is immediately some energy in going into turning that around, because the school board members on the north side of town don't want to have a south side school with an F, and so they immediately start taking action. So what I hope to accomplish today with our panelists, we have the state of Florida that has been grading schools for more than 14 years with this nomenclature. We have the state of Oklahoma that has maybe your second or third year? Second year of issuing grades. And then Senator Tollison, you may be going second, in the state of Mississippi, where they passed the legislation and they did something really unique. They spent actually a really long process working on the calculation, and I want him to spend a lot of time talking about that. And then we'll have a couple of moderated questions, then we'll open it up for questions from the audience. So with that, Representative Fresen, talk to us about Florida.
Thank you very much. Is this on? Okay. Patricia, first of all, thank you so much for helping to put this together and for moderating and for bringing the halls, because I too have a little bit of a cold, so I'm hoping I'm not going to lose my voice. And thank you all for coming out and for being engaged and informed on this topic. As Patricia said, in Florida, and I was warned yesterday, you're going to be on the panel for Governor Bush's signature issue, so don't blow it, no pressure. The grading system is a signature issue for Governor Bush's reforms and for reform in general for two major reasons, I think. First is because the tip of the spear, the main thing that the school grading system has is transparency. Prior to us implementing a grading system and really shining a light on what the schools in Florida were doing or what they weren't doing, parents, what a school was doing was a secret. Parents really didn't know. Even though Florida claimed to have had an accountability system in place since 1991, there really was no measurement, there was no comparison, there was no familiarity of measurement for any one parent to know, is my child's school doing well? And if so, what are we saying is well? What's good? What's not good? How is it compared to the school down the street? Do I have a choice in that? Is there anything that I need to know other than, I think I kind of like my kid's teacher and it seems like a halfway decent environment? There was no other information available to parents. So the major point driving this entire thing is what people don't know is what could most hurt them. So the first thing was transparency. We're going to shine a light. We're going to open up the information. We're going to unveil the screen here and say, this is what your school is doing or is not doing. And the second thing is familiarity. As Patricia said, that you can't communicate, people can't understand. The familiarity, nothing is more familiar within an education context than a grading system, A, B, C, D, and F. It's what everybody grew up with when they were in school, and it's something very familiar to a parent to understand and to be able to gauge what an A means and what a B means. Everything that has pretty much taken place since that inception of the grading system has been more to what I guess we're going to hear from Mississippi, has been the recalibration of the measurement itself for the grading system. But the one thing that I've been incredibly proud of throughout that entire time, throughout that entire evolution of what we call our grading system that was truly implemented in 1999, was that the one thing we have never backed away from, and we will not back away from, and you start seeing it on a completely bipartisan level at this point, more and more so every year, is that we're not going to back away from measuring and from being able to inform our parents of what a school is doing or what is not doing. We can argue, we can debate what the measurement elements of a grading system should be, and oftentimes that's what we do, and oftentimes when we tweak, that is what is actually driving that discussion. But to ever think that you're going to move away from having a parent have at the tip of his or her fingers the ability to know, is my school actually educating my child or are they not? That's one thing that Florida has been committed to, thanks to Governor Bush from the moment he got there, and that's something that we're never going to back away from. And to any state that's getting there, as Oklahoma just did in the past 2 years, or states that are going to get there or trying or aspiring to get there, I would tell you that the biggest challenge right up front is that unveiling. Most of your pushback is going to be from folks that don't want that curtain unveiled to see what is or what is not happening in schools. Once that's there and people become knowledgeable, and by people I mean the consumers of education, the children, the students that are engaged in the system, the parents, once they have the ability to recognize, I had no knowledge before and now I have knowledge, they'll never allow your system to move away from that. So then everything should, from that point on, be, what are we measuring? Are we measuring something that's valuable? And what is that value of what we're measuring? And how do we equate that to a grade and to a performance standard that we're going to give to our parents? That's what Florida does every single year. I think that's always going to be, like Governor Bush says, reform is never final. I don't think the elements and the measurement tools that we use for said reform are ever final. But the crux of the entire grading system and the fundamental element of it, which is to let parents know and to let the consumers of education know, is this provider of education doing their job or not, is critical, I think, for any state to move forward in their education system. So I love this discussion. I'm glad that we're having it today, and thank you for having me as a panelist.
Senator Tollison, tell us, you carried the bill in Mississippi, and talk about that process and what you learned in it, and then also the whole process of developing the calculation.
Thank you, Patricia. I appreciate the opportunity to tell Mississippi's story. And I think it's pretty interesting. This started actually in our 2012 session. My colleague, Vice Chair Senator Nancy Collins, who is here. Nancy, would you raise your hand? She was kind of the inspiration for this. She had introduced a A through F grading bill, and it didn't change the old accountability model, but it changed the labels, and it certainly was an eye-opener. I remember we were in Education Committee, and the then State Superintendent of Education, I think he had a pause, and he's like, well, we ought to put this off for 2 or 3 years, and then we can adopt this. But Nancy was persistent, and along with her and Senator John Polk, they pushed this through, and we've got it passed and put the labels in place over the old system, which was a 7-tier system. And I've got this was what the system was. It was very vague. You had star as the top, high performing, and then you got into successful. And then these terms like academic watch and what at risk of failing, but they were very confusing to not only educators, but to the legislature and certainly to parents. They couldn't grasp what all this meant. And there were school districts out there that had a successful level, but really, if you looked at it, there are other factors considered that weren't necessarily successful. So we kind of did an overlay on that. But for example, one district, 3 out of 5 schools were academic watch or at risk of failing, but yet they were a successful school. Another one was a completely successful school, but was academic watch and low performing. And all of this kind of came up through a debate on another bill, the charter school bill, because we wanted to use the A through F label to say that you could allow charter schools to be authorized in A through C schools without local school board approval. And when we realized all the confusion about how we labeled schools and whether they were really afforded, they should have that label, we said something needs to be done. So we passed this basic overlay on the A through F bill. And then another component is, if you see the blacked out boxes there on the far right corner, the lower performing schools, they didn't include graduation rate in determining where they were as a school. It was only the high performing schools. So this opened everybody's eyes in the legislature and said, wait just a minute, this is not an apples to apples comparison. So we left session, and in July, the State Board of Education, because of the not considering graduation rates for all of the high schools, they dropped the high school graduation for everybody. Well, you can imagine what folks in the legislature and everywhere else, I mean, I remember just blowing up as other people did. So out of that, they decided they wanted the State Board of Education to appoint an accountability task force to look at our accountability model. And this worked great, because once they set this up with members, superintendents, as principals, other educators involved in working with the new accountability system. At the same time, the foundation came into Mississippi, and we were able to work with them. We made introductions with the Department of Education, and the process with this task force went for about 1.5 years. So we worked through that summer, and there was not a member of the legislature that was on this task force, but we were there attending the meetings. And this was something new. I don't know in other states if y'all have this kind of firewall, unintentional or not, between your state educational agencies and the legislature, but we did. We were kind of used to the Department of Education comes to the Education Committee, drops the bill in your lap and say, this is the way it is, and you pass it and go on. Well, things changed a couple of years ago, and we started questioning, we spend 62 cents out of every dollar on K through 20. Let's start determining we need a little more accountability, and this how this comes up. So the accountability model, we worked on that through the summer. It was a lot of conversation. This was the first time, and you'll hear this from MDE officials, it was transparent. It was deliberative. There was input. But ultimately, we came up with a framework. So when we went into session in January 13, I had a framework of a bill that I wanted to make sure that we had it codified, so to ensure that when we left in session, because as some of you folks in the legislature know, when you leave your state capital, the state agencies sometimes don't do what was said or forget about what was said. And so I wanted to make sure that when we left, we had it codified in stone, etched, chiseled, or whatever, that this accountability model, the new accountability model, was codified and it was going to be adhered to because it was the law. It was in the Mississippi Code. So we passed that, had that framework. The accountability, I was hoping the accountability task force would have been finished by our session, but it wasn't done. And they continued through this year, the beginning of this year, and we went through the summer. Again, me and my chairman of House Education attended these meetings to make sure that the members of that task force understood that this was important to us, because I think when you do the labels in A through F, it's important that you have a good, solid background when you reach that level. So eventually the task force finalized that we had a technical review committee, because as you know, there's a lot of details to work out. But we did finalize that. And again, at the end of the day, once this final report was adopted, I think everybody was very happy. And quite frankly, I think it's one of the best accountability models in the nation, if I should say so. And but backing up, we had our first time of a pure labeling of our schools, and it was great to see communities. Fortunately, I'm from a community that were straight A's. The schools came out with straight A's, but there were other schools that had raised up from a B to an A or a C to a B, and it was a lot of pride in there. And then you would hear conversations of saying, parents did not know that this school over here was a D. There was a disconnect because the superintendent was saying, oh, we're doing great things over here, but then this grade comes out, and it's like, well, that doesn't match up with what you've been telling me. And parents are starting to demand more of their schools because they see very clearly and that there's not what's going on or what they've been told. And sometimes that's, a little sunshine provides a lot of information. But as you know, this is Florida's, what they did, and they showed us in terms of when they adopted this, and you saw the number of schools that were A and B and the reduction, and even when they increased standards, which is for another day. But here we are in Mississippi, and we're moving. We have that crossway point. These are the numbers of schools that this past year, we have 335 that were A and B and 236 that were D and F. So the trend is moving back, and there's no question it makes a difference that we have had this A through F grading, that schools, superintendents, principals, teachers, parents, everyone is paying more attention to what is going on in the schools and what we're going to do to make our school our A and B school. This just goes to show another trend of looking at this. But this is one thing that I did on my own, because we talk about poverty and the impact of poverty in education. Governor Bush says, well, let's look at the impact of education on poverty. These are a lot of districts in the Mississippi Delta, and they're D and F school districts, but in those, you look at the schools, there are A and B schools. And I want to say, what is the common denominator in those A and B schools? And I'm able to use this A through F labeling, and I want to go to those schools. I know what it is probably. It's good principals, effective teachers, things of that nature. But I want them to be recognized because there they are in a failing school district, but yet they're able to make a difference and provide an A and B school. Actually, one of those schools, it's in our capital, Jackson, Power APAC. This is the QDI score, which is, they had the highest in the state, 242. That's amazing that they were able to do that, and they should be credited for that. That will change with our new accountability model that we adopted. But I mean, this gives you a clarity that, I don't know, it's just so logical. When a school, if school grades weren't any good, I guess we just need to ditch them for K through 12. Because they work pretty well with our children. I mean, we got report cards last week in Mississippi. In the first 9 weeks, we had A's and B's. I think it just makes logical sense to do the same thing with the schools, A through F. And I think it's a good foundation to work on other things, not only with identifying these schools, but for looking at other incentives for encouraging schools to move up to that A and B level. And like you said with Florida, we were a beneficiary of best practices. There were some things that Florida had done that we eventually took out, but y'all had 14, 15 years, we were able to condense that down into 1 year and learn from your best practices to adopt what we did eventually adopt.
Senator Jolley, tell us about Oklahoma's experience.
Sure. Before I begin, I want to say a word of thanks to Governor Bush, Patricia, and the whole foundation team for inviting me back to speak and for hosting this summit really on the largest state-led challenge facing our country today, and that is the quality preparation and education of tomorrow's generation of leaders. As my placard reveals here, I'm from the great state of Oklahoma. While I come from a people that are humble in their roots and kind of like to be proud of our humility, I'm proud to say that I'm an Oklahoman. We are truly a great group of individuals and families that believe firmly in God, family, country, helping our neighbors in times of need, and in the power of the individual to weather storms and trials, not only to survive but to thrive in the face of furious winds and unexpected terrors. We're also a group of people who allow ourselves to be defined, self-identified as over-the-top sports fanatics. Whether it be one team that unites the state, which is the Oklahoma City Thunder, or if it's the, there you go, or if it's the college and high school teams that we root for every weekend. We are absolutely nuts about our sports teams. I'm a proud Oklahoma Sooner. To quote our fight song that we appropriated from Yale and North Carolina's fight songs, I'm a Sooner born, I'm a Sooner bred, and when I die, I'm a Sooner dead. When we defeated Rich Crandall's Notre Dame Fighting Irish a couple of weeks ago, we were all on cloud nine. We were just happy as could be. When we were humiliated by the Texas Longhorns this last Saturday, we were just devastated. But you know what in both the local newspapers and the TVs had the Sunday after those games? They had report cards on OU's performance. Our quarterback could do no wrong after the Notre Dame game. He earned an A from our local sports columnist. Our pass rush was also given an A, but our short yardage offense was given a D by our local sports columnist after the Notre Dame game. After the Texas game, the only A that was given by our columnist was to the Cotton Bowl security team that denied entry to Governor Fallon's stepson because he forgot his ticket. These are all grades about our beloved Sooners. Some of them are brutal, some of them may be biased, but they are grades we all look at and agree with most of the time. Compare that to the grades that came out about the performance of our public schools last year. The outcry from local education officials was deafening. And some of their legislators were quick to respond that they, of course, agreed. It was just horrible. It was anti-public education. What many of them had voted for just less than 1 year prior, they now tried to distance themselves from quickly. Guys, it was hard. And then it got worse. University of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State University came out with a scathing criticism of the A through F report card, saying that it was unethical to use, was unsalvageable, and should be scrapped. Now, this report was paid for by the Oklahoma Superintendents Association. There were proposals immediately to scrap the system. There were proposals to take the system back to the old way of calculating academic performance and then just giving grades out based off of how far from perfect the scores were. There were proposals just to let OU and OSU create their own system that they just said was unsalvageable. Through it all, the governor, our Senate Education Chair, our House Education Chair, and those of us who authored the bill were firm in our conviction that you don't throw out good policy just because the results are hard to hear. You look at the system and ask, how do we make it better? Let me be clear. I authored the original proposal, and when the grades came out, I wasn't happy about the distribution of the grades. I saw problems with the way that the first rounds of A through F grades were done. Lots of high schools earned A's. Very few elementary schools were able to do so. Schools that didn't have many students in the bottom quartile of student achievement statewide, they didn't even get grades to protect student privacy in some of the factors, and it didn't make a fair apples-to-apples comparison. 82% of our schools were given a B and C, and we had fewer schools classified as failing or below average than had been on the needs improvement list for decades. Clearly, there were fixes that need to be made. In this vein, I reached out to superintendents to ask them legitimately what it would take for them to stop their opposition to A through F system and embrace it. There were two major proposals that came from them. The first was to reduce the percentage of growth from 50% to 30%, and make it less about growth and make it more about just pure academic performance. This reform was embraced by districts such as the one in which I live, as well as other suburban areas of Tulsa and Oklahoma City. However, it was met with strong objection from the leadership of the metro and urban school districts because they traditionally have poor academic performance but did better on growth. The second proposal was to radically change the expectations of what is achievable and what should be considered growth. While this plan, I truly believe, was suggested in good faith by some of these administrators, the results that would have followed were simply unconscionable on its face. Under their final proposal, over 90% of all schools in Oklahoma would have been given an A. What Oklahoma did, I think, that would be good for other states to model is a few things. First and foremost, we had a results be damned mantra, that we weren't going to calculate the system based off of the grade distribution that we wanted to see. Now, we were going to be conscious about how the grades were going to be winding up, but we weren't going to allow it to determine the course we took. Secondly, we made it about things that are hard to argue with. We made it about academic performance and growth. It's a pretty bright line to see where performance is when looking at those metrics. The other factors which had been a part of them, graduation rate, dropout rate, et cetera, they were all removed from the base score and became part of a bonus of 10% that was allowed to count towards the districts to allow them to raise their grade but not be counted against them. And lastly, we tried to work and engage with our Superintendent's Association, but we weren't going to be held hostage by them. Working with people in education is a key factor and shouldn't be ignored by anyone. However, there is a difference between working with them and trying to reach agreement and forfeiting your will and decision-making power to them and allowing them to unilaterally make the decisions for you. At the end of the day, the governor and legislative leadership agreed that what we crafted was better product than what we had the year before, and our Superintendent's Association did not oppose the amendments. They adopted a neutral position. Our grades are beginning to be released just this week, and I can already tell you there will be another firestorm of controversy. But in all my conversations I have with people about these A through F grades, I simply try to remind them of these facts that many of us know. The United States is lagging in educational attainment around the world. Just last week, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development announced the U.S. has dropped to 16th of 23 countries in literacy, 21st of those 23 in numeracy proficiency, and 14th in problem solving in technology-rich environments. So the U.S. is lagging internationally in educational attainment. And just how is Oklahoma performing in this lagging nation? According to NAEP, we are 44th in 4th grade math. We're 43rd in 8th grade math. We're 39th in 8th grade reading, and we're 40th in 4th grade reading. We aren't exactly tearing it up. When we grade our Sooners on their performance, no one says we're bad-mouthing athletes or trying to destroy college football. When we grade our students on their individual report cards from their teachers, we don't accuse them of trying to sabotage their futures. The first step to solving a problem is admitting you have one. Oklahoma and the rest of the nation has a problem. Providing realistic, easily understood grades on academic performance is a key factor in both recognizing the problem and solving it. And our future generation of leaders depend on it. Thank you.
So there could be a lot of places we go with this conversation about A through F grading. One of the things I wanted to talk to the audience and have the panelists talk to them about is if you heard a lot of these discussions from the representatives, especially from Mississippi and Oklahoma, talking about the details and the focus on the details in the calculation, that kind of discussion did not occur when the labels didn't mean anything to the parents or to the lawmakers. It was until the label meant something that then people wanted to dive into the calculation. And Representative Fresen could certainly comment on this. And I think Mike Thomas, who was a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel, could comment on this as well for the state of Florida, that it was only after we started grading schools A, B, C, D, F, did people then look at what is the learning that is actually going on in the school and what is actually being measured. But Florida actually is a pretty mature state. I sometimes describe the power of the A through F label is really a two-edged sword, okay? That means that it works to effectively communicate. It also means that it's going to be under much greater scrutiny. People will pick apart the calculation because the label has so much value and meaning. So Representative Fresen, Florida's been, issuing grades for 14 years, and in the recent transition, we moved to next generation Sunshine State standards, which was kind of a step toward getting to Common Core state standards. The new tests, the new FCAT tests were given a couple years ago, and since those new tests were given, the state board has taken a lot of action to change the calculation. They've done a lot of things to the calculation, including most recently adopting a provision where schools don't drop more than one letter grade, which we have described as grade inflation. But I would like your take on what has been going on in Florida. What do you think some of the issues are related now that we have been in this mature state, and what do you think that the future holds for A through F grading in Florida?
Yeah. When Florida first started grading the schools, immediately it was just something simple for parents to understand, that we were going to start off by just being able to measure learning, right? And then the next step to that was, well, there's a value in measuring not only academic performance, but obviously some sort of a balance between academic performance and student learning gains. Now, the politics that can polarize on both those sides all depend on what the measurement outputs of your school are. All of a sudden, you'll look at the results and say, oh, if we weighted academic learning gains more this year, I would have earned a higher grade, but then next year that might be different. So at some point you have to figure out and just say, this is a perfect, or this is a good enough measurement tool to be able to say a school that has a good combination of both academic performance and learning gains and some other factors that stakeholders recognize as being legitimately and having value. Those are the values that should go. In Florida, through its maturity, as Patricia mentioned, the value or the impact, rather, that the school grading system has on Florida isn't just within the educational spectrum. It's an impact that occurs throughout the entire society. It impacts real estate values. It impacts the way that companies market themselves. It impacts the way that, that a community, when it goes to market itself, will say, I have A schools or I have B schools. So the impacts are no longer just within the educational community as they are perhaps in a state that's still the only ones really taking notice are the stakeholders in education, which are your superintendents and your teachers and some of the folks that are inside the apparatus of education. In Florida, the maturity now impacts other sectors. So what happens is that there is oftentimes, unfortunately, the reflex to not want to have that light shown on what's going on, what's really happening and what's not. So sometimes we want to, the easiest thing to do is to retreat back to what's comfortable. The way to retreat back is to say, well, if we know that the impact of having a lower letter grade this year is going to impact you a little bit negatively, let's try to keep away from that. And I would caution not only our own state in the future as we continue to mature in grading, but other states as well, that the major element that provides a system of grading with any value whatsoever is whether or not the measurement means something. If it doesn't mean anything, it's kind of like what the CEO, for those of you that were in the discussion now, was talking about. The concept of a graduation rate, if it ultimately is watered down to having zero significance other than a piece of paper, there is no value to 100% graduation rate. The same truth lies within a grading system. There has to be some sort of a value. Now, I think perhaps one of the things that we're learning in Florida, and on this point, certainly moving forward, I think that we need to start leading with the principal tenet of communicating properly what a school grading system does. That's where I think, if anything, Florida, in its most recent example, as a state, perhaps failed to do. All the people that are inside the apparatus of Florida's education system, superintendents, DOE folks, some of the folks over in the legislature, we knew that when we moved to the next generation state standards, of which I sponsored a bunch of the implementing bills for it, and as we moved forward with the FCAT 2.0, as we called it, which was a higher kind of standard, it was a deeper standard of understanding, we all knew that there was going to be a momentary a temporary impact on school grades. So a school that perhaps over the last 4 or 5 years had been cruising on an A or a B or a C glide path under standards that perhaps had become stale or a little bit watered down. The moment that you increase those standards, you know it's going to happen. Those first couple of years, there's going to be a dip. But if you look at the longitudinal averages of what has happened in the Florida grading system, you know that they will eventually pick up again. What happened was people in the apparatus knew it, parents didn't know it. Apparently, more people than we didn't know it. So what happens is when the impacts were going to happen, people started setting their hair on fires, and I will tell you that those very folks in the apparatus that did know, including superintendents and others that knew it was coming, they all aided and abetted the panic and all said, oh my God, I can't believe that our school grades dropped. Well, you knew that that was gonna happen, but the problem was, and where I as a policyholder in the state of Florida will take some responsibility for it, is that moving forward, and I will advise everybody here from all states, make sure that you have a communication plan up front, in the middle, and towards the end as you're moving forward with it, so that parents are not only understanding what a letter grade means, but that parents are understanding what it is that you're measuring, the value of that measurement, and to make sure that nobody panics as a result of it, but that really what you're doing is just you're setting up their children for higher success, and that the label isn't really a label on them or a label on the school, but it's a true in-time measurement of how they're performing based on the new standard. And I think that's critical in particular as we move forward with the implementation of higher standards of the Common Core standards, because the only value that we're going to have in our measurement in Florida outside of the way that we communicate it is for me to know as a policymaker, how is an A school in an otherwise underprivileged neighborhood in Miami-Dade County doing compared to the A school in the senator's D or F districts in Mississippi that are performing at an A level? Is there a comparability? Is there something of value that we can replicate from Mississippi over to Florida? If we don't have some sort of a high standard, a non-panic approach to how we're measuring and what the result of that measurement is going to be, then we fail the system. Then all we're going to end up doing is having an easy to understand letter grade system that at the end of the day may not have much value. So one of the things that was happening prior to the 2.0, and one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure, and a lot of my colleagues are here in a second row, I thought I was going to get more heckled, that they helped me and that we all kind of collaborated in, was to make sure that we were starting to see a trend where even A schools in Florida or B schools, so and this is important to point out, and I know that oftentimes in the grading system we focus too much on let's highlight the F schools, the poorly performing schools, but the value of a grading system is across the entire paradigm of grading. There's a value in comparing A schools to A schools and B schools to B schools because they're not all created equal. So one of the other things that the grading system in Florida did very well is that parents that thought that they had a great school, right? And now that there's actually a way to measure and see the point turnout of what their A meant, the range of an A school is rather broad, right? So there could be an A school that you think, oh, my school is an A school, they're doing great. Well, compared to another A school, and maybe they're on the lower end of the range of the A school, and you could still approach that principle and say, I think we can do better. So there's a value in the entire grading system, but if all we do is out of fear of what the backlash is going to be in the absence of proper communication of what it is that we're measuring and what it is that we're trying to do with this, if that wins the day, then all we're going to end up doing is having a cute marketing campaign of A through F without having any real value to it. So I think moving forward, it's critical, Patricia and all of us, that we have a really concerted and positive communication campaign and really messaging to the parents, because otherwise those that are more likely to want to sustain the status quo and to push away from having that light exposed on what is or is not happening in the system, they will immediately fill that void with their opinion about it, as opposed to letting those that are directly affected by it have a say in that. So moving forward, I would just say to anybody, as you're going to implement a system or evolve your system moving forward, make sure that you're constantly checking your standards, making sure that the standards have some value, but that as importantly, you communicate what it is that you're trying to measure to parents and to stakeholders throughout the system so that they won't fear it, but rather embrace it.
So, Senator Tollison, A through F grading is slightly controversial. Tell us a little bit more about your calculation process, your school accountability process. What were some of the dynamics of the people who worked on the measures, and how did you all overcome some of the challenges in putting together the calculation?
I think that one of the things that I think about the new accountability model is the components provide incentives for schools to focus on certain things that I think are important. For example, and this is an incentive for the legislature, we are an ACT state, so we're on include the ACT in the component as a component in the new accountability model, and contingent upon us funding it, which I hope we will do. And hopefully that will encourage our ACT scores to rise, because high schools will focus more on students taking the ACT. Right now, there's not a lot of focus on it, and they wake up on a Saturday and go to high school half asleep and go through the process. Some schools do well, but now that it will be a component going forward, they may become an ACT testing site and really focus and try to bring our statewide score up. And I think that's important. One of the pieces that I think Florida had was looking at we have a bad achievement gap. I guess every state does, but Mississippi has an achievement gap, and trying to really work on that bottom 25% to make sure we work towards closing that gap. And we're doing some other things related to that with early childhood education and third grade reading literacy act. But part of that was saying that the bottom 25%, at least, you got to show growth in at least 50% of that, and that's a component. So that's encouraging our schools to focus on that bottom quartile that they have that otherwise they might not be doing. That's one of the components of reaching a grade. But one part that was initially proposed was saying if you do not have at least 50% of your bottom 25% showing growth, you would lose a letter grade. Well, that finally got the superintendent's attention, and they opposed that. They didn't like that, and so they came in and made their plea to the task force, and the task force ultimately agreed with them and removed that penalty for not reaching 50%, losing a letter grade for losing 50%, not having 50% growth in the bottom 25%, but we still have that, and it has a growth component. So that was a big part of it. And then the last part of adding is acceleration components. Encouraging schools to do AP classes, dual enrollment, IB courses, things like that, so that they can, even with AP, that you reward participation, and then you also reward performance. So a lot of these are working to encourage schools to work to improve college and career readiness. Mississippi, based on our ACT scores last year, only 12% of our students are college and career ready. So obviously we need to do a lot more to work towards that. So the idea is using this accountability model to move more students to being college and career ready.
Thank you. Senator Jolley, at one point in time during your process, I think that institutions of higher education even came out against the A through F system. And so tell us a little bit about what happened and how you all handled that.
And they're still arguing against it today. One of the things that they did an analysis. First off, they were requested to do it at the behest of the Superintendent's Association, as I mentioned. They came out and said it was unethical, unsalvageable, shouldn't use it. That all we were doing was perpetrating, fictional measurements that were unusable. They never said that about the Academic Performance Index, which counted the exact same things as A through F. Never griped about it then. We didn't change one thing that we were measuring. We just changed how we were determining those and added growth as a component. But they're still out there objecting. In fact, there's a news release out from OU and OSU's education groups this week saying that the reforms that the legislature made it even worse, and that 70% of a kid's academic success is not determined by what happens in the school building. Now, I don't know about you, but that sounds pretty insulting to me, to great teachers and great principals that are changing lives in school districts across every demographic. For these people to say 70% of it you're giving a grade for things they can't control, So should we redirect 70% of the funding into those things so we can try to do a better job of controlling that? I mean, that's a question that I think is a legitimate one to pose. The administrations of both OU and OSU have somewhat distanced themselves and said that they're not speaking on behalf of the university, just to let you know. And I appreciate their willingness to do that. But it still shows up that OU and OSU say that what we're doing is completely wrong. In fact, they testified at a recent interim study that we should just get rid of all testing, period, because it's not usable and it's just bad for the kids and we should get rid of it. So I'm waiting to see the University of Oklahoma, my alma mater, and Oklahoma State University, where my wife attended school. I'm ready to see them get rid of the GRE. I'm ready to see them get rid of the LSAT. Let's see them get rid of the GMAT for the medical school admissions. If that's what we're going to, if these tests, if all testing is not good, if you can't trust the academic results, okay, then let's just get rid of all academic entry exams for higher ed. It's amazing to me that some of the things that they say go unchallenged. It just gets reported in the media and nobody really focuses on what they say. But when they say that 70% of the factors in a child's life are predetermining their educational opportunities or outcomes, they're saying that a teacher in a classroom and an effective principal and an effective teacher can't change lives. I reject that notion. And thankfully, my governor does as well.
Great. We're going to open it up to audience questions as you all are getting to the microphones. I want to point out a couple of things. First of all, these are really brave and courageous elected officials who are here, who are willing to stick with a policy, even though there are obstacles and challenges and critics. And I want to let everyone in the audience know, if you're contemplating doing an A through F grading system, it will be extremely powerful to drive student behavior in your state. It will also be extremely controversial, and you will have lots of obstacles and challenges because, as you've heard some of the representatives and senators talk about, there's immediate focus, there's immediate sheer scrutiny of the tests and the accountability system and the calculation that goes along with it. So if you're going to proceed in that direction, you have to be very thoughtful and you have to better be prepared to be courageous. Yes, sir.
Captain Ed, on the school board in the Florida Keys, and Florida's a big state, and but even in smaller states, things that appear to be clear at the legislature aren't necessarily so clear out in the hinterlands. And my advice to everybody, we've had problems with the formula and political pressures. I mean, just recently, we raised the scale and there was such an outcry, we backed it off 50%, and it was a single vote, swing vote on the State Education Commission that did that. I'm not sure I understand all the subtleties of the formula. The formula needs to be transparent and understandable to the parent community, because the chief problem, the chief resistance to reform and rigor are unsupportive parents who are undereducated on what it is that all the professionals are trying to do. That's going to be even more the case with Common Core. And I've said at our school, we need to tell our parent community that the Common Core is going to change the way some things are graded. It's going to do away with grade inflation, but of course the problem is that nobody wants to be on the left side of the bell curve, particularly not my little Johnny. And you have to prepare the public for that. There's a big public education component that we haven't done as well in Common Core as we need to. And we have to get our teacher community on board, because they're the best ones to educate the parents. And that would be my advice to everybody who's going through this or about to go through this. You got to be transparent about the formula so it's understandable. And we have to market this. We have to market this. And those are the challenges.
Great, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Carrie.
Hi, Patricia. Carrie Briggs from the Bush Institute. Really actually want to applaud the senators for your courage in doing this. I'm curious about what happens to the schools and your systems when they make an F or a D, either for 1 year or multiple years in a row? Kind of what are the consequences?
I can tell you right now, we don't have any consequences, and that's intentional. We don't have consequences on it because we are still wanting to make sure that we get it right. But I think that eventually we should absolutely applaud those schools that are seeing a raise in grades. Eventually, once we've got the kinks worked out in the implementation phase, I think we have to then start looking at schools that are perennially Fs. We've had schools, one of our former Tulsa school board members is here in the audience with us today. We've had some schools on the needs improvement list for 15, 17 years. Nothing's happened to them. I think there should be a consequence of being on a couple of years, 2 to 3. But I think we should also celebrate with bonuses, with financial rewards, those schools that get an A, those schools that move up from F to D, D to C, C to B, B to A, or if you make the leap from F to A, we should really do what we can to give you some type of a financial reward and also recognize that achievement. But right now, for Oklahoma, because we are in our infancy on this, I don't think it's right for us to begin penalization or rewarding until we know that we've got this nailed down and we're not changing it very much, if any, from here on out. At that point, then I absolutely believe that should be the next step that we take, which I think Florida, I don't know if they did it at the very beginning, but I know Florida has done some things in that regards. But we're not there yet, but we need to have that as a goal.
Florida's system does have some codified, for lack of a better term, consequences for F schools. But most of the consequences in our grading system are on the carrot side, I would argue, not on the stick side, meaning, yes, we identify chronically failing schools, and we say that if you fail for more than 1 year, you have to put together what's called an improvement plan and a turnaround plan, and you have to submit that to the State Department of Education, and there are certain mechanics that your school has to go to. But as far as actual real consequences, whether or not it's, school's gonna get closed down, it really only happens where there's a real consequence for a school either being shut down or repurposed or whatever it may be in the choice side, not necessarily in the conventional school side. But most of the consequences are towards the, as I said, carrot side, meaning our school recognition policy in the state of Florida, which is embedded in the budget, awards schools that do well. So if you get an A, you get school recognition dollars, a B, a C, et cetera. So most of the consequences are aimed at incentives and not necessarily negative consequences. I would argue that one of the things that Florida either did consciously or didn't, or unconsciously, that is a consequence to a potentially chronically failing school, is that at the same time, concurrent, I mean, if you look at the actual timeline of the school grading system, the accountability system being implemented in 1999, if you follow that timeline and follow the timeline of expanded choice options in the state of Florida, whether they be charter or tax credit scholarships or whatever it may be, they both basically worked concurrently. So a lot of the consequences that happened in chronically failing or chronically D schools were coupled not necessarily with a conscious policy about penalizing a school that's an F or a D, but rather in the school recognition funding aspect of it, you award schools that are doing very well, but in the same environment in Florida, you also saw a lot of children leaving, basically deserting those failing schools and going into options that were more readily available. The consequence of that has been fantastic, by the way, because even the conventional public school system has responded to that by in itself offering more conventional choice options to its students so that if the parents aren't happy in one school, they can go to another. So the consequences across the system, both when you couple expanded choice, incentivized-based funding, and we have. I don't think our language on negative consequences is strong enough. That's just my humble opinion. In Florida, I think it could be stronger as far as having a little bit more of a stick for chronically failing schools. But I think as long as we stay committed to the other two concepts, which are school recognition, incentive-based funding in our schools budget system, and coupling that with providing parents in those schools as many options as possible away from those schools, that in itself is kind of a redirected consequence of a chronically failing school. But realistically, what are the consequences other than the tedious effort of a superintendent and their staff having to come together with a turnaround plan and submitting that plan to DOE and that sort of thing? There isn't any real negative consequence associated directly with a chronically failing school yet in Florida.
Real quickly, we don't have any, we have something, but I think it's going to be eliminated. But as I said, having the A through F model gives you a basis to do some things. And in our accreditation system, the Board of Education, when a school loses its accreditation, the state board has the option of penalizing them in their sports and cutting the number of games in half and eliminating them for playoff participation. What? Yeah. Well, let me tell you. There was a school district, and two times within my tenure, they were taken over by the state. And that second time, the state board put some teeth into it and said, we're cutting your sports in half. All of a sudden, you got everybody's attention, and you really got it. So I know there's some legislators saying, maybe I should do the same thing when a school, not the school district, limited to a school, a high school or a middle school, when they are an F school for 2 years in a row, have the same penalty because they are familiar with that penalty when they lose accreditation. So I suspect that'll be something that we'll address maybe this year.